Let me begin this way. Years ago, my mentor, Mr. Schoaf, looked me right in the eye and said something I've never forgotten. He said, Jim, your mind is a factory, and whatever you run through that factory all day long will build the fabric of your life. Now, when he said that, I didn't understand it. I thought the big changes came from big events, big opportunities, big decisions. But he said, no, Jim, it starts with the ingredients. The mind works with whatever you continually pour into it. And that was the day I realized something important. Most people don't fail because they lack potential. Most people fail because they never learn how to manage the factory between their ears. They're running high hopes on low-grade ingredients, and that's a disaster waiting to happen. You know, people come to me and they say, Jim, why won't my mind help me? Why do I procrastinate? Why do I avoid the hard things? Why do I keep slipping back into old habits? And I tell them, your mind has been helping you. It's been helping you build exactly what you've been feeding it. If you pour in doubt all morning, you can't expect confidence to come marching out in the afternoon. If you pour in gossip, you can't expect wisdom. If you pour in fear, you can't expect courage. The factory doesn't argue. It just takes the orders. And that's why this lesson is so crucial. Because once you learn how the mind really works, even just the fundamentals, you stop fighting yourself. You stop dragging your feet through life. You stop negotiating with your own weaknesses. Instead, you learn how to feed the mind properly. And let me tell you something marvelous. Eventually, the mind will begin to push you toward better action. It will insist on better habits. It will force you, yes, force you to do the difficult things that make life worth living. Not because you're fighting with willpower, but because the factory has changed its materials. Tonight, I want to show you how to do that. I want to show you how to give your mind the kind of ingredients that build a powerful life. I want to show you how one shift in mental diet can change how you walk, how you think, how you decide, how you act. Because the truth is simple. We all live with the results of what we feed our minds. Every one of us. And if you want the results to change, the ingredients must change. So let's get started. Let's talk about this marvelous, miraculous, sometimes dangerous machine called your mind and what happens when you start feeding it the right stuff. Now let's take the next step. Because after Mr. Schoaf told me the mind was a factory, he said something even more startling. He said, Jim, the things you think about all day long, those are the ingredients being poured into the machines. And the machines don't judge. They don't filter. They don't say, hold on now, that's not good for him. No. They just take it, process it, and deliver it right back into your life. And I remember thinking, good grief, no wonder my life was in a mess. I was handing the workers in my mental factory a steady supply of junk and expecting them to produce gold bricks. That's not how life works. Let me give you a little picture. Back in those days, I used to start the morning with the newspaper, and not just a glance, no. I'd sit there with my coffee and load up on every murder, every robbery, every stabbing, every disaster, every scandal. I'd flip to the back pages and read the tragedies for dessert, and then I'd head off into the marketplace and wonder why the world looked so dark. I was walking around on my financial knees, my emotional ankles, and I figured it was just the times. No, it wasn't the times. It was the ingredients. It was the mental diet. You see, the mind is incredibly literal. If you think about opportunities, ideas start appearing. If you think about problems, problems line up to greet you. If you think about good fortune, you start noticing doors you never saw before. But if you think about envy, resentment, worry, and defeat, your mind says, that's what we're building this week. Let's get to work. Let me ask you something simple. If you ran a restaurant, would you let rotten food into your kitchen? If you managed a clothing store, would you let a truck deliver boxes of shredded rags? Of course not. You'd stop it at the door. You'd send it back. You'd say, we don't deal in that. But people let junk into their minds by the wheelbarrow every day. Arguments, gossip, fear, drama, cheap entertainment, negative voices. And then they wonder why their confidence is thin and their decisions are shaky. My friends, it's the ingredients. Your mind can't produce a masterpiece from rotten supplies. Here's the truth. Mr. Schoaf drove into me. You don't rise to the level of your hopes. You fall to the level of your thinking. And the thinking is built from the ingredients. If you want a stronger body, you change the food. If you want a stronger mind, you change the mental diet. It's not magic. It's cause and effect. So take inventory. Ask yourself, what have I been feeding my mind lately? What books, what voices, what conversations, what content? Because those things aren't just passing through. No, they're being packed, processed, and stored in the warehouse of your future. And once you grasp that, the power of raw materials, you'll handle your thoughts with more care than you handle your wallet. And that's when life begins to shift. That's when you start building a mind that works for you instead of against you. Now, once we understand these ingredients, we must talk about the next great secret, how one bad ingredient can ruin the whole blend, and how one good ingredient can change everything. And for that, we need a story about coffee. Now, let me give you one of the best lessons Mr. Shoaff ever taught me. And he taught it with a cup of coffee. He said, Jim, suppose someone walks up and puts sugar in your coffee. What happens? I said, well, you'll be fine. And he said, right. Then he leaned in and said, but suppose someone puts strychnine in your coffee. What happens then? I said, well, you're dead. And he said, correct. Then he paused the way mentors do when they're about to drop something heavy. And he said, Jim, life is both sugar and strychnine. So you'd better be careful what you put in your coffee. That one hit me like a ton of bricks. Because I realized that all day long, I had been letting people, strangers, friends, television, newspapers dump ingredients into my mental cup. Some sprinkled a little sugar, good advice, good ideas, positive thinking, encouragement, but others were slipping in poison. Doubt, worry, envy, gossip, fear. Some did it intentionally, some accidentally, but the results were always the same. Sugar makes you stronger, poison makes you weaker. And the mind does not care who hands it the cup. It only cares what's inside. Let me tell you something important. The universe does not excuse the poison just because a friend delivered it. Poison is poison, no matter how politely it's packaged. You'd be amazed how many people get their strychnine from people they love. A negative uncle, a complaining coworker, a fearful parent, a cynical friend, someone who says, be realistic, don't aim too high. People like us don't get chances like that. Better play it safe. And they pour all that right into your mental cup. And if you're not careful, you drink it. And once you drink it, the factory goes to work, building your life from the poison you accepted. See, it doesn't matter whether your worst enemy gives you sugar or your best friend gives you poison. The results are the same. And people wonder, Jim, why can't I get my confidence back? Well, it's the coffee. Jim, why do I sabotage my own goals? The coffee. Jim, why do I feel anxious and uncertain? The coffee. If you consume daily doses of negativity, you cannot expect a positive life. Nature won't allow it. Let me put it another way. Imagine somebody walking up to your house, trying to dump a trash can in your living room. You'd say, now hold on a minute. Not here, you don't. But people dump trash into their minds all day long. Gossip, criticism, disaster stories, meaningless arguments, shallow entertainment, fear-based narratives. And meanwhile, the mental factory inside is saying, well, this is what he ordered today, let's get to work. But here's the good news. You don't have to drink someone else's mixture. You can guard your cup. You can say, no, thank you, that doesn't go in my mind. You can choose sugar ideas, books, mentors, purpose, gratitude, discipline, and reject the poison. Because the moment you do, the moment you become responsible for what goes into your mental cup, everything changes. Not instantly, but inevitably. You start tasting life differently. You start thinking differently. And before long, you start being different. So remember this simple rule with enormous consequences. Watch your coffee. Because what goes into the cup goes into the mind. And what goes into the mind pours right back out into your life. And now that we understand the danger and the power of the ingredients, we can talk about the next great principle, how to control the door, how to guard the gate, how to decide what enters and what must be turned away. Now, once you understand the power of ingredients, once you understand the danger of poison and the value of sugar, there's only one conclusion you can come to. You must stand guard at the door of your mind. And when Mr. Shoaff said that to me, I thought it was just a nice phrase. But he said, no, Jim, this is a full-time job, not part-time, not when you feel like it, every day. Because if you don't guard your mind, someone else will gladly do it for you, and they might not have your best interests at heart. Let me tell you something important. Everybody has an opinion about what you should think, and most people are more than willing to hand you their leftovers. their fears, their doubts, their complaints, their small ambitions. And if you're not careful, you'll adopt someone else's limits and live inside someone else's box, not because it's where you belong, but because you never guarded the gate. Think about it. You would never let just anybody walk into your home, track mud across your floor, raid your refrigerator, rearrange the furniture. You would say, hey, excuse me, you can't just walk in here, yet people let strangers on a screen walk into their minds every day and rearrange their thinking. A flick of the thumb, scroll, scroll, and here come the thieves of imagination, the vandals of confidence, the pickpockets of peace. My friends, you must be as careful with your mind as you are with your home, maybe even more. You've only got one mind. You can move to a new house. You cannot move to a new head. So how do you stand guard? You become aware. That's the first step, awareness. You start noticing the voice of the complainer. You start noticing the cynic. You start noticing which social feeds leave you inspired and which ones leave you anxious. You start noticing which conversations make you smaller and which ones make you bigger. And when you notice, you make a choice. Give a little wave of the hand and say, no, thank you. That doesn't go into my mental factory. You don't have to argue about it. You don't have to explain yourself. You simply decline the trash. But it works both ways. Standing guard isn't just about keeping things out. It's also about letting the right things in. Wisdom, inspiration, education, encouragement, books that stretch your thinking, people who see possibilities, ideas that make you sit up a little straighter. Those are the guests you welcome. Open the door wide for them. Say, come in, stay a while. My future needs you. Here's the great truth. Your mind is too important to leave unguarded. If you don't control the door, life will send you all sorts of characters. Some will build you, some will break you. Some will water your dreams, some will trample them. But the guard decides who enters. And you are the guard. So every day, ask yourself, what am I allowing through the gate? What am I saying yes to? What should I be saying no to? Because the quality of your life will always follow the quality of your guard. Now, after we stand guard, something remarkable begins to happen. When the right ideas, the right voices, the right content, the right habits begin to flow in, a new force takes over, something far more powerful than motivation or willpower. The mind begins to work with you. It begins to take your side. It begins to move you forward automatically. And that brings us to the next great principle. When your thinking becomes dominant, consistent, and purposeful, the mind starts doing the work for you. Now let me share a principle that changed everything for me once I finally understood it. It's the rule of dominant thought. And it goes like this. Whatever dominates your thinking eventually shapes your behavior. Not sometimes, not occasionally, every time. If a thought occupies your mind long enough, your body will follow, your habits will follow, your decisions will follow, and ultimately, your destiny will follow. Most people don't appreciate how powerful this is. They say, Jim, I want to get in shape. Yet all day long they think about convenience, comfort, shortcuts, excuses. And the mind says, that's our order for today, comfort. And sure enough, when the time comes to exercise, the mind delivers what it's been building, 100 perfectly reasonable reasons to stay on the couch. Another person says, I want to be rich. But their dominant thoughts are scarcity, fear, risk, losing. And the mind says, very well, we'll avoid risk at all costs. And that person never makes the call, never takes the chance, never steps into opportunity, not because they lack talent, but because the factory was instructed to avoid anything uncertain. Dominant thought wins every time. But here's the wonderful part. This law works in your favor the moment you decide what the dominant ingredients will be. When you begin thinking daily about health, real health, your mind starts nudging you. Let's drink some water. Let's take a walk. Let's skip the junk food. When you think daily about growth, real growth, your mind starts saying, pick up that book, take that course, step into that conversation. When you think about discipline, real discipline, your mind starts insisting on structure. Get up, write it down, keep your promise. The mind is a marvelous servant, but it must be trained. And the training comes from what you feed it consistently, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, until the thought takes root. And once it takes root, the mind becomes your secretary, your accountant, your personal trainer, your project manager. It starts reminding you of things, pushing you toward things, protecting you from things. Just like a well-trained helper, it begins to anticipate your needs before you speak them. Let me give you an example from my own life. There was a time when I struggled terribly with worry. It dominated my thinking. Morning, noon, and night, I worried. And the mind, being obedient, began producing more things to worry about. Small things, big things, imaginary things. It shaped my moods, my decisions, my health. Worry had become the dominant architect of my day. And as long as it stayed dominant, my behavior followed. I couldn't out-willpower it. I couldn't outrun it. Because the factory was only doing what I instructed it to do. But when I changed my dominant thoughts, when I began focusing on gratitude, solutions, action, possibility, slowly the mind shifted. Worry lost its seat at the head of the table. And before long, the mind was saying, let's look for answers. Let's find perspective. Let's stay calm. The factory changed management, and life changed with it. This is why I tell people, your life doesn't get better by chance. It gets better by thought. The right thought, held long enough, becomes intention. Intention, held long enough, becomes habit. Habit, lived long enough, becomes character. And character decides your future. So the question is simple. What is dominating your thinking? Not what you visit once in a while, not what you wish for when you're feeling inspired. I mean the thought that returns every day. The thought you rehearse, the thought you feed, the thought you polish, because that thought is building something in your life right now, whether you realize it or not. And once the right thought becomes dominant, you no longer push yourself uphill with willpower. The mind begins pushing you. It begins to insist on a better life. It becomes your ally instead of your adversary. And that, my friends, is when discipline begins to feel natural instead of painful. That is when the difficult becomes doable. When you no longer fight your mind because your mind has joined your team. And that leads us perfectly to the next great turning point. A moment every successful person experiences sooner or later, the point where you shift from trying to change your actions to changing your identity. Now, let's talk about one of the greatest discoveries you can make on the road to personal development. The shift from willpower to identity power. And let me tell you, this is where life gets exciting. Because willpower is a struggle. Willpower is a push. Willpower says, I hope I can. But identity says, I am. And when your identity changes, everything changes. See, most people try to change their lives by forcing new actions on top of an old identity. They say, I'm trying to be disciplined. I'm trying to be consistent. I'm trying to be confident. But you can try all day and still lose the battle, because the mind will always return to the identity it believes is true. If deep down you see yourself as inconsistent, the mind will find ways to prove you right. If you see yourself as undisciplined, the mind will sabotage the routine. If you see yourself as unlucky, you can walk past opportunity every day and never even notice. Identity is the magnet. Behavior is the metal. So how do you shift identity? It begins with what you repeatedly say to yourself and what you repeatedly feed to your mind. Because the mental factory doesn't just process what you think, it processes who you think you are. If your dominant thought becomes, I am a person who finishes what I start, your mind begins organizing itself around that idea. It begins rejecting actions that contradict that identity. It begins nudging you to complete tasks, to keep promises, to close loops. Why? Because identity must be consistent. Let me give you an example from my own life. For a long time, I identified as a worrier. Not as someone who worried occasionally, but as a certified, chronic, professional worrier. And guess what? I lived up to the title. If I didn't have something to worry about, I'd worry about the fact that I wasn't worrying. That identity shaped my behavior. It shaped my conversations. It shaped my days. And it took me nearly a full year of mental discipline to shift that identity. Not to someone who tries not to worry, but to someone who simply doesn't live that way anymore. Identity power is quiet. It doesn't boast. It whispers, I am this kind of person now. And the mind says, understood, we'll adjust accordingly. Let me tell you something important. When your identity shifts, your habits follow you automatically. You don't have to drag yourself into the gym you go because you're the kind of person who takes care of their health. You don't have to force yourself to read. You read because you're the kind of person who invests in their mind. You don't have to push yourself to work. You work because you're the kind of person who does excellent work. Willpower tries to change the action. Identity effortlessly changes the behavior. Imagine a tree. You can tape apples to the branches and call it progress. That's willpower. Looks good for a day, maybe two, but those apples will rot. But if you change the seed, if you plant something different, you don't have to tape anything. The fruit appears naturally. That's identity power. So how do we change the seed? By changing the ingredients we feed the mind. By reinforcing the thoughts we want. By eliminating the thoughts we don't. By deciding who we are, and then giving the mind the evidence it needs to believe it. Once that shift happens, once the mind accepts a new identity, discipline becomes a natural expression of who you are, not a battle with who you were. You no longer say, I hope I can. You say, this is what I do. You no longer rely on willpower. Your routines become aligned with your sense of self. The mind begins to insist on behaviors that match the new identity. And that, my friends, is the real secret of transformation. Don't work harder on your behavior than you do on your identity. Because once identity changes, behavior takes care of itself. Now, the question becomes, how do we build an identity that works for us every single day? How do we install the right inputs, the right routines, the right habits, the right influences, so that identity grows naturally and powerfully? For that, we need a practical system. A daily blueprint, something you can follow for the next 30 days to transform the very materials your mind is made of. And that brings us to the next major section, building a mental diet that upgrades your entire life. Now that we understand identity, and we understand the factory, and we understand the ingredients, it's time for something very practical, a system you can follow. Because philosophy is wonderful, but without a routine, without a daily method, the mind drifts. And remember what I told you earlier, you cannot drift to the top of the mountain. You must climb. And climbing requires steps. So let me give you what I call the Rohn mental input system. A simple plan, a 30-day transformation, not complicated, not overwhelming. Just daily ingredients that, when repeated, begin to shape a new identity and a new life. Let's start with the first component. 1. 10 pages of something wise every day. When I was a young man, Mr. Schoaf said, Jim, every book you read pours powerful ingredients into your mind, and every book you avoid deprives your future. 10 pages, not a marathon, not a whole book, just 10. But 10 pages daily is 3,650 pages a year. That's dozens of books, and it changes your thinking. The mind begins receiving better instructions. You start hearing better language. You start absorbing better ideas. And slowly, almost without noticing, the factory begins producing better results. 2, 5 minutes of reflection. Quiet time. Just you and your thoughts. Ask 3 questions. What did I do today? What did I learn today? What must I change tomorrow? Those 3 questions can alter your entire direction because most people never pause long enough to think. They're living life like a runaway train. No stops, no check-ins, no evaluations, but reflection is where growth happens. And the mind loves reflection because it gives the factory clarity. 3, morning and evening, gratitude and goals. Why gratitude? Because a thankful heart attracts opportunities. And why goals? Because the mind needs instructions. Gratitude opens the door. Goals tell you where to walk. And it only takes a few moments. Write down what you're grateful for. Write down what you're aiming for. And pretty soon, the mind starts connecting them. Gratitude builds confidence, and confidence makes goals feel possible. 4, 30 minutes of skill building every day. No exceptions. A business skill, a money skill, a communication skill, a digital skill, a leadership skill. Why? Because skills determine your value in the marketplace. And the marketplace does not pay for potential, it pays for skill. But here's the good news. Skills compound. And 30 minutes a day is enough to change your entire trajectory. The mind begins saying, we're becoming valuable, we're becoming capable, we're becoming someone people rely on. And that feeds identity. 5, clean up your environment physically and digitally. You can't expect mental clarity while living in mental chaos. Clean your room, organize your desk, unfollow the negativity, mute the gossip, remove the noise, add the mentors, add the books, add the voices of value. You're designing not just a space, but an ecosystem for excellence. And the mind responds to environment faster than anything else. Change the environment and you accelerate the identity shift. 6, one bold action every day. What I like to call Rohn risk reps every day. One phone call you've been avoiding. One message you've been afraid to send. One decision you've been postponing. One little step toward courage. Remember what I told you earlier? It's all risky. Trying is risky. Not trying is disastrous. So each day, teach the mind that risk is normal, that courage is expected, that action is who you are, and the mind will begin rewarding you with confidence. 7, a weekly review your personal board meeting. Once a week, sit down, no distractions, and ask, what ingredients did I feed my mind this week? Are they producing the life I want? Do I need to adjust the system? This review is where you catch mistakes early. It's where you realign. It's where you protect identity. Most people go years without evaluating themselves, but not you, not anymore. You're building consciously now. You're pouring in ingredients deliberately. And the factory is learning to follow your leadership. Now let me reassure you, this 30-day system is not perfection. It's consistency. Don't aim to be flawless, aim to repeat. Because repetition builds identity, and identity builds destiny. 30 days of these inputs, and I promise you, your mind will feel different, it will think different, it will operate different, and most importantly, it will begin to push you. When you give the mind the right ingredients every day, it becomes impossible for the mind to stay the same. It must evolve, it must upgrade, it must produce something better. And that brings us to the next great phenomenon, one of the most exciting discoveries in personal development. What happens when the mind, trained properly, begins to take over? Now let's talk about something extraordinary, something you'll begin to notice after you've followed this mental diet for a while. It doesn't happen on day 1, it doesn't happen on day 2. But somewhere between day 10 and day 30, a small miracle begins to take shape. Your mind starts doing the work for you. What once required effort begins to feel natural. What once felt heavy begins to feel light. And the habits you used to fight for start appearing almost automatically. See, most people think discipline is about gritting your teeth and forcing yourself. They say, Jim, I'm trying so hard to be disciplined. Well, trying is good at first. Trying gets you on the path. Trying builds the early momentum. But discipline becomes effortless only when the mind accepts it as part of who you are. When the identity shifts. When the mental factory gets used to running on better ingredients. Let me give you an example. Do you remember the first time you tried to wake up early? It felt like a wrestling match with your own pillow. But after a few weeks of consistently feeding your mind the right ideas, purpose, goals, gratitude, reflection, something remarkable happens. The mind says, hey, we get up early now, that's what we do. And suddenly, instead of hitting the snooze button, you're waking up with a sense of anticipation, not because you forced it, but because the identity has changed. Or take exercise. At first, you negotiate with yourself. Should I? Shouldn't I? Maybe later. But once health becomes part of your mental blueprint, once your dominant thought becomes strength, vitality, longevity, the mind starts nudging you. Let's move, let's sweat, let's take care of this body. And if you skip a workout, The mind taps you on the shoulder and says, something's off. This isn't like us. The factory wants to stay aligned with the identity it has built. Same with reading. First, it's a task. Then it becomes a habit. Finally, it becomes a desire. You start looking forward to those 10 pages because of how they make you feel. And soon, the mind says, bring me more. Let me think. Let me grow. And you find yourself reading 20 pages, 30 pages, not because someone forced you, but because the mind has developed an appetite for wisdom. This is what I call automatic discipline. It's when the mind stops resisting the good and starts rejecting the bad on its own. It's when negative content feels unpleasant and growth feels natural. It's when fear tries to speak up and the mind says, sit down, we're doing this anyway. It's when procrastination becomes uncomfortable and progress becomes satisfying. Let me tell you, that's a beautiful day, the day discipline stops being a battle and becomes a rhythm. The day you no longer think, I hope I can, but instead say, this is just what I do. This is who I am. That's identity, power at full strength. And here's the best part. Once the mind starts operating on this higher frequency, you become dangerous in the best way. You start seeing opportunities that others miss. You start taking actions others avoid. You start building qualities others admire. And the results begin to multiply. Your confidence rises. Your decisions improve. Your habits align. And people begin asking, how are you doing all this? And you smile because you know the factory changed. I used to think the great transformation of life came from one big moment, one big speech, one big opportunity, one big decision, but I learned it doesn't happen that way. The great transformation comes when the mind, properly trained, becomes your partner, when it stops being the enemy, when it stops sabotaging and starts supporting, when it stops holding you back and starts pulling you forward. And at that point, you don't chase discipline, you become disciplined. You don't chase confidence, you become confident. You don't chase success. You become someone success is attracted to. That's the promise of the mental factory. And that's the result of feeding it the right ingredients day after day until the identity aligns with the destiny. Now, with all of this understood, the ingredients, the guarding, the identity, the automatic discipline, there's one more piece we must bring together. One final message. One closing reminder that ties this entire seminar into a single principle you can carry for the rest of your life. Well, my friends, we've come a long way together. We've talked about the mind and its factory. We've talked about ingredients, good ones and dangerous ones. We've talked about the sugar and the strychnine, about standing guard at the door of your mind, about dominant thought, identity, power, discipline, habits, and the marvelous transformation that occurs when the mind finally joins your team. And after all of this, I want to leave you with one final message, simple, clear, unforgettable. You must stand guard. Your future depends on it. If there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that the battle for a better future is first fought and won in the mind, not in the marketplace, not in your job, not in your environment, right here. In the privacy of your own thinking, the world can hand you challenges, circumstances, setbacks, disappointments, but only you decide what gets inside your mind. Only you decide what thoughts take root. Only you decide what ingredients the factory will process. And let me promise you this. If you feed your mind well, life gets better. If you feed it poorly, life gets harder. It's not a mystery. It's not magic. It's cause and effect. People ask me, Jim, what's the secret to a good life? Well, there's no one secret, but there's a start. You start with the mind. You stand guard. You choose what enters. You reject what doesn't belong. You pour everything you've got into becoming the kind of person your future needs. And you let the mind armed with new ideas, new habits, new identity carry you toward the life you imagined. You know, the world is full of people who are careless with the door of their mind. They let anything in, any voice, any opinion, any negativity, any junk, and they wonder why their confidence wavers, why their discipline collapses, why their progress stalls. But not you, not anymore. After tonight, you know better. After tonight, you understand the power you hold. After tonight, you walk out of here as the guard of your own gates. And if you take this seriously, really seriously, your future will feel the difference. You'll catch yourself making better decisions because your mind is clearer. You'll catch yourself showing more courage because your identity is stronger. You'll catch yourself taking more action because discipline has become natural. And people around you will notice. They'll ask what happened. They'll say, you seem different. And you'll smile because you'll know exactly when the change began. The moment you took responsibility for the factory inside your head. Let me leave you with one of my favorite reminders. It's simple, but it carries a lifetime of wisdom. We must all suffer one of two pains, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. Discipline weighs ounces. Regret weighs tons. Choose discipline. Choose growth. Choose your future. Stand guard at the door of your mind every day, and you'll be amazed at what life hands you in return. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take these ideas, use them, live them, share them, and let's all make the next month, the next year, and the next chapter the greatest we've ever lived, starting with the thoughts we choose tonight.